Stay with me for a moment because what I'm about to tell you might completely change how you see yourself in the bedroom. Most men walk around carrying a quiet pressure. They don't always talk about it, but it's there. It shows up in the back of their mind during intimacy, in the way they compare themselves to others, in the way they question if they're good enough. And a big part of that pressure comes from one simple question that almost every man has asked himself at some point. How long am I supposed to last? It sounds like a simple question, but the answer most people believe is completely wrong. And that's where the problem begins. Because when you believe something that isn't true, your mind starts building expectations on top of it. Expectations turn into pressure. Pressure turns into anxiety. And anxiety quietly starts affecting your performance in ways you don't even realize. So today, I want to strip all of that away. Not with opinions, not with guesses, but with actual data, real numbers, measured, timed, collected from hundreds of couples around the world. I'm Dr. Chloe Anderson, and this is Real Talk Bedroom. And today, we're going to answer one of the most misunderstood questions in men's sexual health, not based on what people say, but based on what actually happens in real life. Before we even get into the numbers, we need to talk about where your expectations came from. Because most men didn't wake up one day and decide that sex should last a certain amount of time. That idea was planted. It came from what you saw growing up. Movies that made everything look intense, dramatic, and long-lasting. Conversations where people exaggerated. Content online that was designed for entertainment, not reality. Over time, all of those influences start shaping your perception. You start thinking there's a standard, a benchmark, a number you're supposed to hit. And if you don't hit it, something must be wrong. But here's the part nobody tells you. Those standards are not based on real human behavior. They're based on performance, on exaggeration, on illusion. And when you compare your real experience to something that isn't real, you're setting yourself up to feel like you're falling short, even when you're completely normal. Now let's step into what science actually measures. In medical terms, we don't just say how long sex lasts. We use something much more precise. It's called intravaginal ejaculatory latency time. That sounds technical, but it simply means the time between penetration and ejaculation. That's it. No foreplay, no buildup, no emotional connection, just that specific window. And that distinction is important because when most people talk about sex, they're thinking about the entire experience. But when researchers study it, they isolate one part to understand it clearly. So when you hear numbers today, remember that we are talking about a very specific definition. Now, before researchers even collected real data, they asked men a simple question. What do you think is the ideal duration of intercourse? And the average answer came back around 16 minutes. Then they asked another question. How long do you think men actually last? The average answer there was about 9 minutes. So already there's a gap between what men think is ideal and what they believe is real. But here's where things get interesting. Even that real estimate isn't actually real. Because when researchers stopped asking people what they think and started measuring what actually happens, the results told a completely different story. In one of the most well-known studies, researchers looked at over 500 couples from different countries. And instead of relying on memory or guesswork, they asked each couple to use a stopwatch. Think about that for a second. Not estimates, not assumptions, actual timing. From the moment of penetration to the moment of ejaculation. What they found was something that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. The average duration was 5.7 minutes. Not 10, not 15, not 20, 5.7. And when you really let that number sink in, it starts to challenge everything you thought you knew. Because if the average is under 6 minutes, then what does that mean about all those expectations you've been carrying? It means most of them were never accurate to begin with. Now, of course, there was variation. Some men lasted only a few seconds. Others lasted much longer, even up to nearly an hour. But those are extremes, outliers. When you average everything together across hundreds of real couples, from different backgrounds, different ages, different lifestyles, you still land right around that same number, just under 6 minutes. And here's something else that adds another layer to this. The study also found differences between countries. In some places, the average was shorter. In others, it was longer. For example, in one region, the average was around 4 minutes, while in another, it approached 10 minutes. So even globally, there isn't one fixed standard. There's a range, which means the idea that there's one correct amount of time is simply not true. But despite all of this, many men still feel like they're not doing enough. And that brings us to the next question. What do women actually want? This is where things get even more misunderstood, because when people talk about what women prefer, they often throw out numbers that sound much higher. You might hear something like 20 or 25 minutes, and immediately that creates pressure. But here's what's important to understand. Those numbers are usually referring to the entire sexual experience, not just penetration. They include everything: the buildup, the connection, the rhythm, the emotional engagement. When you isolate just the penetration phase, those expectations change. And more importantly, research consistently shows that duration alone is not what determines satisfaction. This is one of the biggest misconceptions out there. Men are often taught directly or indirectly that lasting longer equals being better. But that's not how human intimacy works. Satisfaction is influenced by multiple factors: connection, communication, comfort, arousal, attention. And when you focus only on time, you ignore everything else that actually matters. In fact, for many women, penetration alone is not the primary factor in reaching orgasm. So if a man is focusing all his energy on extending duration, he might be missing the bigger picture entirely. And this is where performance anxiety begins to creep in. Because once a man believes he needs to last longer, his focus shifts. Instead of being present in the moment, he starts monitoring himself. He starts thinking, how am I doing? Am I close? Am I going too fast? Is this enough? And the moment your mind goes there, something changes. Your body is no longer operating naturally. It's operating under pressure, and pressure activates stress. When stress enters the picture, your nervous system shifts. Blood flow patterns change, muscle tension increases, and ironically, this often leads to the exact outcome you were trying to avoid: less control, which then reinforces the anxiety. And just like that, a cycle begins. You worry about performance. That worry affects performance. Then you worry even more next time. And all of it started from a belief that wasn't even accurate. This is why understanding the real data is so important. Because when you realize that the average is much lower than you thought, something changes internally. You stop chasing an unrealistic number. You stop comparing yourself to an illusion, and you start seeing yourself more objectively. That alone can reduce a significant amount of pressure. Now, this doesn't mean that timing never matters. There are situations where duration can indicate an issue. For example, if ejaculation happens almost immediately, consistently, and without control, that could point to premature ejaculation. Or if it takes an extremely long time and causes frustration, that could indicate delayed ejaculation. But these are specific conditions. They're not the same as simply being below some imagined ideal. And the good news is, when there is a real issue, there are real solutions. Not gimmicks, not quick fixes, but evidence-based approaches. Things like pelvic floor training can improve control, behavioral techniques can help retrain patterns, addressing anxiety can restore natural function, and in some cases, medical support can provide additional guidance. But again, the key is understanding the difference between a real problem and a perceived one, because many men who think they have an issue are actually within the normal range. They just didn't know what normal really was. So as we bring this all together, I want you to take a step back and reflect. Think about the expectations you've been holding on to. Where did they come from? Were they based on real data? Or were they shaped by things you saw, heard, or assumed? Because once you see the truth, you have a choice. You can keep chasing a number that doesn't actually define your performance, or you can shift your focus to what really matters: connection, presence, communication. Because at the end of the day, The quality of the experience is not measured in minutes. It's measured in how both people feel. And when you remove the pressure of trying to meet a specific duration, you create space for something much more important: authenticity. You're no longer performing, you're experiencing. And that shift changes everything. So the next time you find yourself wondering if you're lasting long enough, remember this: the average is around 5.7 minutes. Not what you thought, not what you were told, but what actually happens in real life. And if you're around that range, or even close to it, you're not failing. You're normal. And once you understand that, you can start letting go of the pressure that never needed to be there in the first place. Now, if you want to take this even further, if you want to improve control, confidence, and overall performance in a way that actually works, then you need to focus on the right things, not myths, not shortcuts, but real, proven methods. Because your confidence doesn't come from chasing unrealistic standards. It comes from understanding your body, trusting it, and working with it instead of against it. So if you're ready to do that, make sure you subscribe to Real Talk Bedroom, because this is where we break down the truth. No hype, no pressure, just real science and real solutions that actually help you improve. And I'll see you in the next one.